Hello, my name is Clare Dillon, and I'm delighted to be here today at the Open Source Business Forum, speaking to you from Dublin, Ireland. And I'm here to talk about how open source can accelerate digital transformation at a national level, from my perspective. And of course, what might be interesting is that I'm a relative newbie to the open source world. I've only really been working with folks who have been involved in open source communities for about 3 years now. Before that, I worked for Microsoft and I headed up the developer evangelism group in Microsoft Ireland. Now, I did that for almost 9 years and I was in Microsoft for a total of 14 years. And as such, I kind of came to open source pretty much along the same journey as Microsoft did. As many of you will know, they initially were very anti-open source, but came to see the light and are now big proponents of open source. But it wasn't until I left Microsoft that I really began to work closely with people who were very involved in both open source and inner source, which is the application of open source methods within inside a firewall to build proprietary software. And I think what's really interesting about open source is that when we think about it, there are a number of reasons why folks that are involved in digital transformation and innovation agendas should be very interested in open source. The first reason is that fundamentally it's at the source of all, if you forgive the pun, of all of the innovation that's been happening in our tech economy for the last number of years. Everything to do from AI to DevOps to any of the major latest innovations have been based on open source technology. So it's definitely the foundation of our tech economy moving forward. But I think what's really interesting is that what's also becoming apparent is that the skills that are required for open source are now being recognized as being the skills that are the best practices for developing software, whether it's open source or not. So not just the technology that you would be familiar with, but also the processes and tools like GitHub or any other source management system. But more particularly, the behaviors that are involved in building open source code are really valued now in organizations. Things like collaboration, supporting distributed teams, particularly now when so many people are having to work from home because of the COVID scenario. These are skills that are being recognized as being really, really valuable. And also this idea that open source developers have agency. They have a motivation, an intrinsic motivation to build better and high quality code. And all of these things coming together means that it is well recognized now that the skills required for open source are really, really valuable. So much so that many organizations are now using those skills, as I said, to build proprietary code even within their firewall. That's called inner sourcing, when you take those open source methods and bring them inside firewalls. And that's becoming ever more popular in today's software engineering practices. And then, of course, there are a lot of new business models and value streams that are emerging around the open source world. This is no longer just the domain of hobbyist developers who are doing something in their spare time. Many people are using open source as a way to disrupt market leaders by putting something out available as open source, which often causes adoption to rapidly increase. Or they're taking open source code and making services available to third parties under a SaaS model and creating new value streams that way. And we're also seeing some industry collaborations, which are really interesting, in particular in financial services and in healthcare. We're seeing companies come together who would ordinarily be competitors and coming together and sharing some base code that's common to all of them so that they can work on them together. And that is in order for them to be able to accelerate the innovation that might be happening within their industry vertical. We're seeing that particularly in the case of healthcare, even around the world's response to COVID, which has become very, very interesting indeed. And that brings me to an example that I want to share with you, which really is helping me see that there's even one more area where open source becomes incredibly important when we're thinking about any innovation or digital transformation initiative. Ireland, way back when COVID first hit, went down the path of building a tracker app to help identify or help track where people were having symptoms and allow those people to share their close contacts or people who had been within a particular distance of them, if in the event that they tested positive. Now, this was all done in an incredibly private way. It was a decentralized approach. But the COVID tracker app that was built in Ireland, they decided to actually make that app open source as part of the development process. Now, this was not something that was typical or traditional for applications that were built by the public sector in Ireland. But one of the reasons why they did this in this particular case was because they knew that any app that they produced would have to get the AOK from privacy experts within Ireland. And there had been a lot of concerns about whether or not some sort of tracker app might impinge on people's private dealings and whether it might actually track their location or share information that people didn't want. And of course, when you've got a public health crisis, you need to smooth away as many barriers or objections to the adoption of that software as possible. Now, in this case, the Health Service Executive in Ireland made the COVID Tracker app available as open source and made it available to privacy advocates before they launched the app, which gave those advocates a chance to review the code and to give it their thumbs up. And as a result, Ireland's COVID Tracker app had one of the biggest and fastest take-ups of any app of its kind in the world. And within a couple of days, they had 33% of our population actually having downloaded and using the app, which was unbelievable. And I think now it's up to about 66%. And after they made that app available, they decided to actually work with the Linux Foundation, both the Health Service Executive and the organization who built it, Nearform, who I had previously worked with. They decided to actually work with the Linux Foundation to bring that app and make it available as a project within the Linux Foundation Public Health Project. And as a result, this app now is the basis upon which COVID app trackers have been built all across the world, and even more recently has been launched in New York. And so there are millions of people now using this technology. And I think what is extraordinary about this is that the reason that this was open sourced were none of the reasons that I actually mentioned before, but it was primarily to drive trust, and the transparency that open source gives you builds trust within the users. And it dawns on me that when we think about digital transformation, so many digital transformations fail. I think up to 70% of digital transformations fail. But oftentimes, it's nothing got to do with the technology or even how the technology is built that actually influences whether or not something is successful. But it's often to do with the environment into which you deploy that application. And sometimes that trust is really necessary for people to be able to adopt technology quickly and easily. So when we think about national innovation agendas, we often think about the economic impact that we want to actually have, a positive economic impact. We often want to think about the jobs we can create and the skills we provide citizens with in order for them to be able to take up high quality jobs. And we also think about how do we accelerate innovation within an economy. And these are three areas where most innovation initiatives that I have seen usually focus on. As part of my work in Ireland, I'm involved in the Technology Ireland Innovation Forum, and we would look as a group at how do we accelerate innovation in Ireland, probably across these three areas. But I do think that when you think about that story I told you about the COVID app, really trust and transparency becomes so much an important point that we want to actually influence within our innovation agenda, because it is that adoption of technology that becomes probably the biggest success factor to any digital transformation initiative. And one further point is about accessibility. One interesting thing that I saw when the COVID app was first released is that when that became available on GitHub, one of the first pull requests that went in against the code was actually from a very small town in the west of Ireland called Cahersiveen. And it was someone putting in going, you know, that's not how we spell Cahersiveen down here in Cahersiveen, here's the correct spelling. And I thought, isn't that wonderful? Because not only has this application increased trust by being open source, but it has also given agency to citizens citizens of Ireland, whereby they can actually engage with that technology and make it their own. And sometimes that kind of level of engagement and accessibility can really make the difference between something that becomes successful and people feel like they've a part of it or not. And so that trust and accessibility that open source gives you can be the real game changer when it comes to successful digital transformation. So what can we use as an instrument of change in the context of helping us to accelerate the adoption of open source and the creation of open source technology within a national agenda? Well, one thing I want to share with you here today is the idea of an OSPO++. Now, OSPO stands for Open Source Program Office, and it's a relatively common construct in the context of industry, where often corporate OSPO offices might focus internally on defining policies and processes around open source use, maybe around being a center of excellence around compliance and legal for the organization, maybe measure open source activity, do education internally, maybe manage relationships with foundations and the like, and do advocacy and communications around open source. But if we take the idea of a corporate OSPO and we extend it into municipalities and academia, then we can get the idea of an OSPO++, which is taking the idea of an OSPO, taking it in the context of universities and municipalities, adding in the concepts of all things open, like, for example, open data, open hardware, open standards, open innovation, and scholarships. And these things become so important when it comes to bringing an entire open agenda together. And then add in the element of collaboration. The idea that that OSPO could become an interface to other OSPOs around the world and other institutions around the world, like, for example, open source foundations. And you take all those together and you get this idea of an OSPO++. And for me, the benefits of something like this at a national level could be, there could be a multiple of benefits. The first is that it can actually scale citizen services. It could allow for municipalities and cities and regional governments to have a much better chance in terms of sourcing best practice citizen services and implementing them very quickly. And we could see that in the case of the COVID app. Also, it could also provide a pathway for translation of research into impact. Traditionally, that's only really measured by IP translation and the value that people get or that universities would get from licensing their IP. But in addition to that pathway, perhaps we need to consider the second pathway of what would happen if we not only focused on licensing IP, but also provided an alternative route, which would allow people to actually make their code available through open source, build communities around it, and potentially have more impact in the world, even if there is no immediate licensing fee involved. That can also lead to innovation clusters, and we've witnessed that around the world where people have taken that path. The third area is that something like an OSPO could actually help build the skills for the future. I mentioned that the skills involved in open source are really sought after by corporate software development groups, but this would also allow citizens of a given country to be able to participate in that global open source ecosystem, which becomes so important when we think about the fact that everything is built on open source these days. And then, most importantly, I think that if we actually invested in the idea of OSPO++, then we would actually encourage more transparency and therefore more trust in citizen services, which would help accelerate national digital transformation agendas. So that was what I wanted to share with you here today. I'm involved in an organization called Moss Labs, who are working with OSPO++ organizations in municipalities and in academia, and helping them to create a network where we have a community where we can collaborate around these ideas. If you're interested in finding out more, or if you would like to work with us or even form your own OSPO++, then please do reach out at either Clare Dillon on my LinkedIn account, or in fact at info@mosslabs.io. And we would look forward to hearing from you and look forward to helping open source help accelerate innovation at a national level. Thank you.